Well, thank you for coming to the second session of our Church Legal Seminar Series for the year of 2023. My name is Brian Davis. This is Gary McKeon. We are the Utah-Idaho Southern Baptist Convention's legal team, and we're happy to be here today presenting on governing documents. Before we get into it, I'd like to start us out with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for this opportunity for us to gather, whether it be here in person or the gifts that you've given us in technology, that we are able to discuss how we can help better the churches here in Utah and Idaho. And Lord, I just pray that as we go about this discussion today, God, that we first and foremost, that the conversation look to you, God, and that we turn to you for your wisdom. And then that you use that to help show us how we can use the systems that you have built here on earth to further your kingdom, God. May we never forget that you are the author of it all, and turn to you to guide us during this time. In Jesus' name, amen. So as I mentioned, this is the second part of our series. The first part was on incorporating documents, and that is recently just been posted to the Utah-Idaho Southern Baptist Convention's YouTube page, and we'll be sending out a link to that here shortly within the next couple of days. Like last link, this one will also be recorded and sent out to the people who have signed up for this as well. With that, let's get started.
Initially, as we look at the governing documents in the organization of churches, we need to understand that there has to be a biblical foundation that's involved with it. And there are several verses that in Scripture which guide us there. And we have to understand the basic governing document is the Bible. We're told in 1 Corinthians 14:33 that for God is not a God of disorder, but of peace, as in all the meetings of God's people, God's whole people. 1 Peter, finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind. 2 Corinthians, finally, brothers, rejoice. Aim for restoration, comfort one another, agree with one another, live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you. And finally, in Ephesians, it says, therefore, I, the prisoner in the Lord, urge you to walk worthy of the calling you have received with all humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Now, as we hear and read those verses, we understand that this is a creation of God, the church. The church, though, belongs to Christ. The church is Christ. Christ is the head. So as we're looking at these things, we understand that there's more than ample Bible verses or foundation for what we are doing and what we're going to talk about. But keep in mind, it is God's church, and that's what we're based on. Now, with that in mind, let's go to the first document that we're going to be looking at and understand there's a series of documents, and each have their place and each have their purpose. The statement of faith is on the next slide, and understanding that a church constitution is a biblical document, and we want to emphasize that. It can be called a constitution or a statement of faith, but either way, it is stating who we are as a church. Jonathan Edwards put it this way: whatever ways of constituting the church may to us seem fit and reasonable, the question is not what constitution of Christ's church seems convenient to human wisdom, but what constitution is actually established by God's infinite wisdom. So if we look at that and further proceeding with the idea of a statement of faith, a statement of faith is a declaration of faith and belief, and it sets foundational principles for the church to operate with. In other words, whenever decisions are made or actions taken, it should be within the realm of and come under and really bring to life the faith of the church, that statement of faith. It should be, what we do as a church should be consistent with that. The church has both a spiritual and ecclesiastical, has to have the ecclesiastical side, has a secular side, but the statement of faith is that ecclesiastical spiritual side stating who we are. It is helpful and important if you ever were involved in a legal issue that brings up both secular and legal and ecclesiastical things, to have a statement of faith. Now, the important thing with any of our documents, and including the statement of faith, is that we follow them. It's when we depart from what we believe that problems can arise. The constitutions may contain several things: the official name of the church, a statement of purposes and objectives of the church, a confession of faith and doctrines, of course, a statement of polity, a statement of relationships or affiliations. There are other things that can be in those statements of faith. And part of what we'll be talking about today and mentioning several times is you also will be having, and this will be another seminar, but looking at policies and procedures. And the Constitution will be one factor that will be blended in with all of those. So when you say adhere to it, make sure you understand your faith statement of faith. And it's not just a list of Bible verses, it is what you believe as a church.
So that's the statement of faith and the Constitution. And I did forget to mention that if you are online and you have questions, you can put them in the chat and we have somebody monitoring them. We do have a slide for the end for questions, but we'll still have somebody monitoring for that. Also, if there are any technical issues, please let us know in the chat. So the next section is the bylaws. So the bylaws is the nuts and bolts of the organization. It helps provide guidance for the organization and puts everything into place. They need to be very clear about how the church is to work internally and externally. And these can be on a range of different matters. So you can have the corporate side of it. You can have bylaws that address the corporate side. You can also have bylaws that address how to receive or discipline members of the church. You also want your bylaws to define who are the officers or directors or people who are going to provide some sort of vision or leadership in your church. They also can describe the organization of your church. Again, going back to, are you going to be elder-led, congregational-led, or something in between, or something different entirely? That's something that you want to be placed in your bylaws. You can also define how the leadership structures in the church is going to be going, again, elder-led versus congregational-led or something similar. And also state the responsibilities of each parties within the church. The bylaws should also have a section on the calling of a pastor and the staff. Again, going back to what we were just talking about with the statement of faith, the bylaws is more of the corporate side of the church. However, that does not mean that it has to be devoid of the Bible. It's, in fact, if anything, it should be set on biblical principles. And from that, it should also be able to enable your church to fulfill the biblical mission. But essentially, the Bible should be the foundation for your bylaws. And then from there, you can build the structure for your church.
If I might add, also understand that bylaws should be and can be reviewed periodically, and they can be amended at any time to reflect your needs or developments in the church. So these are things you ought to be kept current on. They reflect who you are as a church and your personality, your identity as a church. So just remember, you can review and evaluate them.
That's right. Your church will most likely start out as a fairly small church. You may only have one pastor, pastor's spouse, and then maybe a couple of congregants. You can still start a nonprofit church and have a church and have these bylaws in place that dictate how everyone will interact with each other within the church. And then, God, Lord willing, your church will grow and you'll become bigger and you'll have more people from the congregation who can step in and fill roles. Well, your original bylaws may not fit that anymore, and you may need to address it. So we would recommend that you look at your bylaws probably every 5 years, unless you have massive growth. but every 5 years, it's be good to just pull out the bylaws and look at them and say, does this still fit where our church is at? And what can we change to make it better suited for our church?
And now as we move on, let's look at one of the first categories, and that is the board of directors or trustees. State law requires both in Idaho and Utah that you have a board, a governing board comprised of at least 3 people. And all corporate powers, understand the word corporate powers, are to be exercised by or under the authority of that governing board, in this case being the board of trustees. And the title can be changed. You can call them trustees, directors, or whatever, but they need to be adults, as 18 years or older. And it's helpful in describing what trustees do is to understand that they are corporate officers, and corporate officers are meant to help and enable and support the administrative or ecclesiastical ministries of the church. And so the directors can be, you can call them a board, or you can just call them a group of people, directors, but understand that they represent the church, and they can be removed if there's problems or issues. But there are multiple responsibilities that the trustees can and ought to have. And let me preface that by saying this. A lot of matters in small churches are handled frequently by and under the pastor. And that's natural because sometimes churches are small. But as you're growing, every minute the pastor spends on handling something that the directors could handle is a minute less he's handling pastoral duties. And the idea of developing the board is that they be a working board, a meaningful board, one that contributes to the benefit of the church and enables the ministries and the mission of the church to be better performed. And they can provide guidance in a variety of things. And the concern we've got is that frequently, and particularly in a small church, or even an old-time church, that trustees are regarded as simply a cosmetic group, and they're there if and when a deed needs to be signed. But there's much more to it than that. And a board can be and ought to be involved in policy making and in other decisions, whether it deals with things like litigation or contracts of big contracts. They should be involved with those things. And so it's directors are selected. They should come from membership, but as they're selected, it's with the idea that they have multiple duties and that they contribute in a meaningful way to the organization and the activities of the church.
And with the board of directors, what the last 2 slides just posted, these are the statutes that Idaho and Utah have posted. However, your bylaws can come in and make changes. So for example, if you say nothing about how long the term is for a board director, it will be by law 1 year. You can change that. It can be 2 years. It can be 3 years. Idaho does have a cap at 5 years. But other than that, you can make these changes in your bylaws to fit what you want for your board of directors. You can also have your board of directors authorize other people to act on behalf of the church. So it doesn't all need to necessarily fall on the board of directors. And that leads us into the officers. So one difference here for officers is that in Idaho, it's not required. But in Utah, it does say that the nonprofits will have officers. And the officers, they're designated by the bylaws. And again, they must be a natural person who's 18 years or older. In other words, it can't be a corporation. In the United States, a corporation can sometimes be treated as if it's a living, breathing person and can hold other entities. By law, for nonprofits, that's not allowed. This must be an actual living human being to be older than 18, who is appointed as an officer. Same thing with the board of trustees or the board of directors. An officer does not need to be a board of director. They can be, but it's not absolutely required. And so these are just some various offices that you can have. You can have elders, deacons, secretary, treasurer, president, or moderator. Again, for Idaho, it's not required to have officers. However, if you choose to have officers, Idaho does require that they be a president, that there be a president, a treasurer, and a secretary. And one person can hold multiple offices. However, one person can't hold both the president and the secretary. Again, churches are exempt from that, so you don't necessarily need to follow that rule. But we do recommend that you have someone who is a secretary of the church and someone who is a treasurer of the church, simply because there are rules and regulations placed on the church, such as keeping minutes or keeping financial documents. That's good to have someone oversee all of that.
Now, with both officers and trustee, you're not limited to what these are. You can have other officers. A main factor is making sure that the expectations of the members as to the officers is clear, and the expectation of the officers as to the church are clear. Expectations is an important part of communications. What does it mean to be a treasurer? What does it mean to be a director? And so you need clarity. And that's where bylaws come in, but also your policies and procedures. And just as with directors, you can set terms of office for the officers. What can happen, and it does frequently happen, is that somebody will take a given position and they claim it as theirs, and they may be a treasurer for 20 years or whatever. Understand, you don't have to do it that way. It's up to you as a church what terms you want to have. And again, it's keeping it clear as to what the responsibilities are and the terms are. But it all goes into acting as a corporation. You are a corporation, so you must act like it.
So the next one is elders and deacons. And again, this is not a role that is listed in the statutes. So this is just one that we see churches have. And so we think it's good to place in the bylaws what it means to be an elder and a deacon. And just for clarity, when I say elder, I mean elder, pastor, and how those are defined in terms. I know that some churches define those differently, but I mean the elder or the pastor of the church. So it's good to have the qualifications of what it is. What is an elder or a deacon? And so it'd be good to place those in the bylaws. I'm a lawyer. I attend church on Sunday, so I'm not going to go too far into the weeds here as far as what an elder or a deacon is. I will leave that to you pastors to instruct me what that is, and I will sit under my pastor and he could tell me what that is. But I will gladly put that into your bylaws for you. But the qualifications are listed in the Bible. You can look to 1 Timothy and Titus for elders, and then 1 Timothy for deacons. It's important to know how pastors are going to be selected. Again, it's your church and you can choose what the process may be. You could have it be where you have a elder selection team who reviews an application for eldership, and then it's posted to the church members to vote on, or you could have it set up in a different way. Maybe if you're just wanting to call someone who their church is going to call the elder, and the church is going to do the search and have the final say. However it is you think it's best for your church is fine. It should be in writing so that way everyone knows the guidelines in which needs to be followed to call an elder. And same thing for the affirmation of the pastor. Who gets to affirm that the pastor becomes the pastor of the church? And how is that going to take place? You could do a vote of approval, and we'll get to voting later, but you can do it in different ways. We recommend you have something written down. And lastly, God forbid this ever has to happen, but if you have to remove a pastor, what are the grounds for removing a pastor? Again, these are important things to be placing into your bylaws, so that way it's clear, not only for the pastor to know what is required of him, but also for the church to know how they can hold the pastor accountable in the same way the pastor is going to hold the church accountable, hopefully, in their Sunday sermons. So it's important to put this into the bylaws, so that way everyone knows the process and the procedures. And so that way they can, if this ever has to happen, and again, God forbid it ever does, but if this has to happen, you know how to act.
I think that to add a couple thoughts here, many of our churches, of course, have come from a traditional or are in a traditional model of Southern Baptist, which is having a congregational form of governance. A lot of the church plants and other churches have either gone to or started out with an elder form. And again, that clarity is important, particularly if you come from a church that has one form and you go to a church that has another form. For example, you may have two churches that unite or merge, and they have to make sure you both understand who does what. It gets back to expectations. One of the distinctions is, if you have elders, is the church an elder ruled or an elder led? And understanding that distinction is important. And we're not here to tell you which to do. What we're here to say is make it clear and communicate well. Communications is really essential. One of the troubles that you can run into, and I say trouble because it can develop as an issue, and that is the elder the CEO? And that's not necessarily so. Spiritually, in that side, corporately, not necessarily. You have to gauge your own church, and of course, a smaller church may not have enough people to fill all the brackets. But understanding part of and I'm just saying from my understanding, as shepherds, part of the role there is to equip people. And part of that equipping is giving them the ability and exposure and allowing them to take on responsibilities of the church, particularly in the corporate area. Let them be the treasurer, let them be the secretary and so forth. But again, it's a matter of being clear on that. And churches can work really well under whatever form of government they have, as long as they understand we're doing what the Bible says, and we're trying to honor God and how we go about doing it. So I think it's just important to recognize there are some distinctions, but you work your way through those and just have a clear understanding.
And we're here to help you work through those. If you decide to go to elder led versus elder ruled, as long as you help us define those terms, then we're happy to help draft that into your bylaws.
A couple of the corporate offices that are important to the church and to any organization. One is the secretary. Traditionally, they can be called church clerks, but the functions of the secretary are and can be very important. Keeping minutes of meetings, keeping a roster of members, having a way to know and reconstruct what happened. Now, when you take minutes, that's not the same as a transcript. Minutes are actions taken or particular things presented. A transcript is a word-for-word account of what was said and done. But secretaries keep track of the action. You can say that the body met, a motion was made to have only green doors in Sunday school. Well, what was the action? Rejected or passed. That's what the minutes will do. They'll reflect, but it's important to keep them. And I can speak from experience with different churches. When they have not had minutes, it can create problems. They go back and they have different memories of what occurred, but they don't document what happened. You keep the record of those actions. And keep files, whatever the records are of the church, you have to keep those, keep them in a safe place. There will be different types of documents and you run into questions of what are confidential records and what are not. If I were to go into a given church and say, tell me how much money Charlie gave last year, that's a confidential information. That's not something I am entitled to know. But the secretary or whoever's handling the records needs to maintain the records. A good example would be background checks on people who are working with children. You have to have that, but you need to keep the confidentiality in place and a way to handle those records. They also make sure that notices are given out and that there's a record of what the notices are. If you have a special meeting, for example, a special meeting can only address those topics which are on the agenda or which are the purpose of the meeting. So your notice has to state, this is a special meeting and here's what it's going to be, what's going to be covered there. So the secretaries can cover a lot of territory. It's an important role. You can have a secretary, you can have assistant secretaries, but the responsibilities are, they're the ones that keep and maintain the records. And part of that process also is making sure that records are available to those who are entitled to see the records. There are some records that any church member ought to be able to see, and there are records that are limited, and they have to keep track of that. One last thought on the secretary is simply that there are policies and procedures that you're going to have, and that'll be the subject of another session. But your policies and procedures can outline a lot more. When I say that, a lot of churches like to have a job description for every position. Job descriptions can be good, but they can also be very lengthy and they have to be well written. But that's where your policies and all come in. If you want to have a job description, fine, but make sure it's a workable one, and again, one that's reviewed, and if necessary, be changed from time to time.
May I just add, just so people in Utah and Idaho are aware that minutes and actions that are recorded must be kept for 3 years. That's, again, the statutory rules. You have to keep them for at least 3 years. Mm-hmm. You could keep them in perpetuity if you wish, but at the very least, you have to keep the last 3 years worth.
I might endorse that because that's a policy. Have a records policy for retention and as well. So that's important to have. Good point. All right, the next office is that of treasurer. Yes, sir.
Sorry to interrupt before the question slide, but is there an argument for any period beyond 3 years? I mean, there's an argument for why you can't keep records in perpetuity, and we have so much attic space or whatever. But what would be an argument to go beyond that, or is it just reasonable to go with 3? Do you have any guidance on that direction?
Well, I would, if I might, there are all kinds of records, of course, but part of the records may be we entered into a covenant with a church plant, and that the covenant may go 5 years or it may go 10 years. You would want to keep a record of those things that are involved for that period of time. But if you're talking like records of Sunday school attendance, you don't necessarily need to keep those.
Mostly things like of the state or things of corporate nature.
Yes,
especially that would be what I
think. But there can be situations, for example, if a church acquired some property and there were conditions with that property, or if they sold it, same thing. You want to have a place where that is documented and kept. And it may or may not be necessarily recorded in the real property records of the county, but you want to know what was the condition that was involved. And it's helpful to have those, or it can even be from a historic viewpoint. How did we develop the organization of the church? Here's how we started off. Here's how the history developed. Now, it's not mandated that you keep the records, but they can certainly be very helpful. On the other hand, you don't need 20 boxes of records that you never use, never look at. So you have to have some evaluation of that. And that's where the secretary and even working with the other officers can say, here are the records that I want to dispose of. What do you think? Is there anything that ought to be kept? So, but it's a good question because you can end up keeping a lot of extraneous things. The opposite side of that is never keeping any records. And one example they need and ought to keep current, and that is your membership rolls. Know who's a voting member. We'll get down to that in a bit. But there are churches that don't even have membership rolls, and that can create a legal problem in a given instance. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, in law school, when you would ask the professors questions, they always said it depends. And so in some ways it depends. And one thing that to keep in mind is that it also really depends on the record that you're looking to keep. Most transactions that occur, that can be sued over, they would be time barred, or like you can't sue after a certain period. Most of the time it's 3 years, but sometimes it can be up to 7 years, and then with land it can be 10 years. Or like if you're looking at like the IRS tax documents, which churches are exempt from if they were to have one, the look back period is the last 3 years. So it's good practice to keep the last 4 years, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where the policies and procedures could really play into effect, where you can start saying, okay, these documents will shred after 4 years, these documents after 3 years. But as far as the minutes of what happens at your board meetings, those must be kept for 3 years.
And you know, it just emphasized records are important, and so you need to keep them, but you need to use wisdom with those. The next office we're looking at is that of treasurer, and that of course has obvious importance, handling the money and knowing what comes in and what goes out. Depending on the size of your church and how you're handling things, that might be a bigger task for some churches than others. But it's relatively simple in a lot of ways. How much money came in, where did it come from, how much money went out, and where did it go? And you can always say, here's what we started with, here's what we ended up with. But there are things you have to look at records-wise, and with handling the monies of the church. First of all, is a basic trust that the people handling the money are trustworthy and you know who they are. That's why such things as having people count the money. You have a policy in place. You should have a financial policy that talks about who does the counting, when do they do it, what do they report. And that would be a very helpful thing for any church to do, big or small. What can happen easily is that when a church plant starts, the church planter becomes the CEO in effect, and the wife becomes the treasurer. And you want to move away from that as quickly as you can, because what you don't want is any person to have any basis to suspect that something's not right with the books. And there's a case that just came out that I think I was going to say Ohio, but just came out of a church pastor who was convicted for embezzlement, and he appealed and he lost. The court said, no, that's not an ecclesiastical matter that we can't handle. This is theft, and so we can handle it. So you want to avoid any sense of wrongdoing, but bylaws can dictate how money is handled, how it's budgeted, and you can be as simple or complex with that as you want. Your policy can address things if you're a Sunday school director and you want to spend some money, how do you go about doing that? Do you have to get permission from somebody? Do you report it? Do you fill out forms? Whatever you do, but you have a system and you follow it, and you make sure everybody understands that system. Frankly, sometimes that's easier said than done, but the importance is maintaining, and it says, appropriate accounting records. And we are in a technical age. I say I'm kind of claiming I'm getting there. But there are so many ways to handle funding and fund matters online, whether even tithing or making offerings, whatever. So much is being done online. You have to know how to use those programs. And again, you have to make sure that the results, the reports are available, because people will get more suspicious about fishy accounting reports than anything else. They'll want to know, where'd that money go? What was it used for? Talking about mail the following within 15 days of a member's written request. Annual financial statements, the church most recently published financial statements, if any. I think that keeping the money out in front, and it's not that money drives everything, but it can certainly lead to suspicion and concern. You want to eliminate, if there's any place you want people to have confidence in, is that their money is being spent in the way that it's intended. And so you need to have policies and procedures in place for that, have details on it. Again, I recommend, to the extent possible, that the pastors or elders not be the treasurer. However, that does not mean they don't get to know anything about it. They oversee, they need to know what's happening money-wise. But you can avoid any questions about how it's being handled by not handling it, letting somebody else do it. So the treasurer is an important position. And by the way, having said this, I recognize that our executive director for the state convention is also the treasurer. It's not a system I would have recommended, but that's where we are with it. But I think, though, that the idea is that the treasurer has an important position because the monies of the church are to be used for the purposes of the church as a religious organization, nonprofit, but the ministries are what, the money needs to go to the mission to help fulfill the mission of the church. And you want to make sure that that is done.
Again, so the treasurer's role is really just to oversee the financials of the church, so that you can build the policies. Your bylaws can be extremely detailed about how money is handled, or you can also give kind of just a broad overview of how it should be handled, and then do policies and procedures to help with the smaller stuff. So, for example, maybe your bylaws will state that it's up to the treasurer to make your budget. Okay. And then you'll have a policy and procedure in place for when the worship leader wants to make a funding request. So you can kind of mix and match all this stuff together to suit your needs. We just would recommend that you do have somebody who is appointed to oversee this sector. It's also important to note that in Idaho, this notice requirement for when someone requests the financials, churches are exempt from that. However, the Idaho also, going back to that question earlier about how long to keep records, Utah requires churches to hold financial records for 3 years. And Idaho actually requires that you hold financial records for 7 years. So again, these are things that it's just good to keep in mind to know how long you need to hold on to records for.
Well, one example there is a designated giving. If somebody gives a gift that I'm giving you $10,000 to build a new building. You don't get around to building the new building for 10 years. Well, you still need to have a record that they gave that money and what the purpose was.
So the next section is on meetings, and there's by law, you're required to have one annual meeting for the members. But other than that, you can have as many meetings as you want throughout the year. You can have a regular church council or board of directors meeting on a monthly basis, or you could have special meetings. It's really just how you can really fit it to your church's needs. The only thing is that you have to be aware of is how notice would go out. If you have, whenever you have your annual meeting, you have to give 10-day notice. And if you're having a special meeting, in other words, one that's just not regularly occurring, you have to give 2-day notice for that. And these notice requirements, they don't need to be mailers or post in the paper. You can make the announcement at church or through email or through any other regular means of communication. The only exception to notice is if there's a regular meeting. So if your board of directors regularly meets on the first Monday of every month or the first Tuesday of every month, you don't need to have notice of that meeting because the people who are supposed to attend know of its existence and know when to attend. Again, there are different types of meetings. So earlier I was talking about the board of directors meeting. So maybe they need to meet on a regular basis to talk about the corporation and how things are going. And then maybe you decide to have one annual meeting for the entire church to update them on church matters, or maybe you decide to have one every quarter. It's really up to you, but I want you to understand that there are different types of meetings that you can have. Lastly, Robert's Rules of Order is not necessary. You are a small, you're a small organization. Even if you're a megachurch, you're still a relatively small organization compared to something like the United States Congress. You do not need Robert's Rules of Orders. There are simplified Robert's Rules if you really want to have something in place, but all you really need is just some method or mechanism so people know when to talk and when a vote's going to be taken. And that could be as simple as just the chairperson saying, all right, are we ready to take a vote? It could be that simple. But just know that you do not need to implement Robert's Rules of Orders. And we really recommend you don't, because it is a complicated set of rules that goes well beyond the needs of the local church.
And most people that quote Robert's Rules have not read Robert's Rules. But if you do use Robert's Rules, have a copy of the one that you use in the office and available for people to look at. There is a Robert's Rules if you go on to a consensus approach that's aimed at a consensus thing. The other comment I want to make is in terms of meetings, there can be an emergency meeting also. And that emergency is where something really drastic has happened. It could be a natural phenomenon, a storm, whatever, a hurricane hits or a tornado hits the church, something that cannot wait for notice to get out. And you have to make a good faith effort to contact those that need to know in order to address them. It could be for, again, there's a fire going on or something in the church and you have to get some kind of permission or authorization for something. Emergencies do allow you to do that. And on Robert's Rules, they're not the spiritual equivalent of Scripture.
Okay, so the next section is on members. And when we're talking about members here, we're talking about church members. And I recognize that not every church follows the church membership or has church membership set up. They may call it something else, their congregation. It doesn't, again, these are just words that would be up to you to decide on what you want to call somebody. But we do recommend that you have some recognition of your church body. But for simplicity, I'm just going to refer to as members here. And again, it's what is a church member? Who gets to be a member of your church? Is this somebody who just has to show up every Sunday and they're a member? Is this someone who has to show up on Christmas and Easter? I hope not. Or is this someone who has to sign a covenant? And again, it's up to you as the pastor to decide that. But we do recommend that you put it in the bylaws as to who is a member of your church. Also, it's important to say how one becomes a member of your church. Again, do you just have to show up on Sundays, or do you have to sign a church covenant? Do you need to take a class to become a church member? Do you need to read a book to become a church member? I've become a member of multiple churches in multiple different ways. So it's really about how you want to set it up. But again, it's good to have those procedures in place. And this is why. It's what rights, privileges, or responsibilities does a member have? And then what also does the pastor have for that church member? So by having this laid out in your bylaws, you can clearly define the relationship between the pastor and the church member. And honestly, where this probably is going to come up the most is church discipline. When do you as pastor have the right to discipline a church member? If it's not clearly stated in your bylaws, then you may get some pushback from the church member if you have to assert some form of discipline. But if you have it written in your bylaws somewhere, and again, this could be a covenant membership or anything else, if it's written in the bylaws, you can always point to that and say, when you joined our church, you agreed to this. And you agreed to sit under the pastorate of this church. So that's why it's very important to have all this in your bylaws, because when conflicts do arise, you have some form that you can turn to help resolve that conflict.
Let me comment just briefly. We should not emphasize too much rights or privileges as much as responsibilities and expectations. And Peter wrote in 1 Peter, but he basically says each person has a special gift, and in our parlance, he says if you have a special gift, use it. And that's what members are expected to do, should be expected to do use it in church, in your service, have a servant attitude.
And just going with that, you could write in there, members don't have rights or members don't have privileges, right? Like you could write that in there if that's what you really want, if that's what makes it clear for you and your church body. Again, this is the whole point of bylaws, is to add clarity to your church organization so everybody knows their role.
Well, one of the things that we would watch out for there is, that's my seat. You can't sit there.
Yeah.
If you have that problem in the church, then you got some things to talk about.
So again, and going to member covenant, I'm a big fan of member covenants. And this quote is from when Jacob and Laban made a covenant. And the only reason why I'm including it here is to show that this is not, when I say member covenant, I don't mean that there is a biblical reference, right, that says that the church must enter a covenant with the church members. No, but we do see that people can come together and covenant with one another. And the reason why I'm a big fan of covenants is because, again, I think it puts the church member on notice. I think it tells the church member what role they have in the church, what can they expect from their pastor. And also it means that they are agreeing to sit under their pastor and the pastoral teachings and pastor discipline if necessary. Will this resolve all conflicts? No. But at least it gives some guidelines, and at least you can always look back at that church member and say, you did sign this covenant when you agreed to become part of our church. So that way, when those conflicts do arise, you have some tools in your toolbox to help address those issues. Also, I think the covenant holds pastors accountable, right? Because the pastor is agreeing to be the under shepherd over that person and give an accounting of that person to God. That's not in writing, and the pastor has to sign it as well. So I think that covenants hold not only the church member accountable, but also the pastor accountable. And if you want more information on this, 9 Marks has a great article on why membership matters. And again, if you don't want to do this, that's fine. This does not need to be in your bylaws. You can completely ignore that last section that I was talking about. And we're still happy to draft whatever it is that you think is best for your church.
Okay, a couple other areas to discuss. And by the way, there's probably many areas we have not covered, but that'll be coming up in other sessions, we hope. But the next one just to address briefly is voting. And voting can be done in a lot of different ways, but we are so used to majority votes. And we go on that basis. It's the American way. We follow that approach. We don't necessarily need to do that, and it's not necessarily the best way. One alternative is going to consensus voting, which is not really voting, but it's, you don't say who's in favor. What you say is there a consensus? And you approach having a consensus. Now, there are some obvious problems that can arise. You can have one person who's just plain obstinate and won't agree to anything. On the other hand, that one person may be the one that's hearing the Lord. So you work your way through, and there's ways to handle that. I was confronted with that in a real way when I was on the executive committee, and I was meeting with the president of the Oklahoma convention, who was Choctaw Indian. And so I was talking with him. I asked him, well, how did he handle going into different meetings? And he said, I check my culture at the door, because I have to go by the Anglo culture, the majority vote. And when I asked him to explain it, he says, we do everything on a consensus, and we work it out together till we come to a consensus. And the reality of that is it works. People can be cautious of it, but it works. However, the important thing is not the method of voting, it's the fact that you make yourself known. You, as a member of a church, have the ability to hear what's going on and to react to that, and to approve or disapprove whatever action or motion is before you. The important part is the involvement. The method part, you don't want to get so legalistic that you get bound up in focusing on that rather than on the substance of the action to be taken. But you can have a majority vote, and by majority vote, you can mean 51%, You can go to a supermajority, which simply means that you require more than 51%. You might recall for 75% or 80%. So again, your bylaws, the procedures and all should specify, and bylaws would be more helpful on that particular point. But there are ways to approach voting. But the first thing is get people to meetings to vote, get people there. And part of that is they have to have confidence that their attendance will be meaningful, that what they say or what they hear will be meaningful. So who gets to vote? Well, again, it's however you as a church want to establish that and set that up. And you may have different means, different places. You may want a committee, for instance, to be have a unanimous decision as opposed to a percentage, or whatever you want that reflects your people. But again, the point is make sure that they are participating in the decision making, make sure that they understand what's being decided, and giving them the opportunity. Now, there are some things where you want to have a clear record and have a vote. And there are a couple examples marked down here. If you're removing members, if you're, or it can even be in adding members. One of the time-honored ways is, hey, Charlie and Beulah have just come forward. They'd like to join your church. Do I have a motion to accept them? Now, I don't always agree with that approach, but that's done a lot. And there's a vote. And it's people there that vote, and they'll say, if you're not a member, don't vote. That's one way you could handle it, by adding a member. Or removing a member. It's going to be more one that follows some meeting where what's pointed out is we've tried to follow the biblical guidelines for handling the removal of a member. We've got to the point that has not worked, and we are now down to this point, and you have a vote or make a decision to do that. But there are going to be times too, and particularly when you're dealing with some contracts, maybe bank accounts, maybe litigation, buying or selling property, where it's going to be important to have something that says the body approved this action. If the church, for example, is going to borrow money to do a building project, the lender is going to want to know that the body voted in favor of that. And that's that kind of thing. That just makes sense, particularly in those matters, to document what's happened. Bank accounts, things like that, or insurance issues. Oftentimes, it's a matter of saying, yes, we'll let Brian be on the checking account, but they have to vote and say we authorize him or open an account. Now, I agree with you. No, but the point is the banks may require something that says this person's authorized to do this with the account or an investment or whatever else. Another place for voting on would be in the adoption of or amendment to a budget, because you're dealing with money issues and you want it to be known that's not just somebody's in leadership's decision, it is something that's endorsed by the body. That endorsement is important because then who's responsible for putting that money in? Who's responsible for giving? And that includes the very members who said, yes, we're in favor of this. So there's an accountability there. But as we look at all of this in terms of voting, it's a matter of clarity again. And as we've emphasized throughout, policies and procedures can address a lot of these things in detail. So voting, yes, it's a good thing to do. Voting is another way of saying we're being heard. Yes, ma'am.
Gary, just FYI, there are several banks in this area who require a written set of minutes where the person that is opening the bank account was elected by the congregation to do so.
Now, as is noted here, there are some banks and financial facilities or businesses that will require the actual minutes confirming the authorization, the opening of the account, a loan, whatever it would be. So that's a good point. And you just need to be prepared. But that also tells you when you're dealing and getting engaged with these different transactions, make sure you understand what the church needs to provide. That's important. The next area, this is my equivalent to it is saying it's like talking to newlyweds about divorce. And that is, you've got a dissolution of churches. And that can happen. Now, the dissolution is twofold. One is of the church as a religious entity, a religious organization. Corporate dissolution is dissolving the corporation. We have one example up in Idaho, because their law is a little different. You can have associations or corporations, and we have one church that dissolved as a corporation and then reinstated themselves as an association. I have no idea why they did it. The requirements, the details, the way they operate is essentially the same. But dissolution means that you've come to a point where you're not going to continue as a church. And what needs to be understood, there are a variety of things. It's not just simply a matter of saying, well, I'm going to call Rob Lee at the Utah-Idaho Southern Baptist Convention and tell him the keys under the doormat, it's yours. It's not the way to do it. It's not simple. The corporation is a legal entity. It has to be dissolved legally and in a legal manner. And state law in both states have a procedure and a requirement of how that's to be done or can be done. Your bylaws should have some provision in there about that. And particularly from a 501c3 viewpoint, they're going to say there has to be something in writing that says, if you're a 501c3 and you dissolve, where do the assets go? And they have to go to a similar 501c3 organization. But you want to have that and you want to document why. But before you get to that point, if there's a conflict that leads to it, and this can happen, not to mention a southern city of ours that's been involved now in a 5-year lawsuit, they couldn't agree and still can't agree. There are times of conflict that can end up in division. You need to be biblical about it. You need to be clear about it. You need to have a good record about it. One of the ways to do that is to have mediation. Mediation can be through court-appointed mediators or ones you agree on. We recommend Peacemakers, which is a longtime organization that handles these kinds of things. Their goal is to help people understand what the conflicts and differences are and what are the ways we can resolve it. If we can't resolve it, what are the ways to handle this in a manner that's honoring to Christ? So we would recommend Peacemakers as a way to go. But with that, Paul wrote about it, and he talks about have a unity, have a spirit of unity that engenders the peace, the unity of peace, a bond. So how is it handled? State law has requirements for it, and you will have requirements you should have in your bylaws or your policies. How do we handle things? Part of that, what to understand there is state law will say the trustees are responsible. And I can't recall, Idaho's is written exactly the same way, but the way Utah states it is that even though you file articles of dissolution, you remain a corporation until all the business of the corporation, including the distribution of assets, is completed. Now, it's not just distribution of assets, it's payment of bills. So all the business things need to be taken care of. So that's where trustees are going to be very important. They are responsible to see that those things are carried out in the dissolution. But what happens with the dissolution? Where do things go? It's easier to say, where do they not go? Okay. So, not to pick on Brian, but we'll pick on Brian. The church is going to dissolve. So Brian says, all right, you're dissolved. I got the check account. Goodbye. I'm going to Mexico. No, he doesn't get the money. None of the trustees get the money. None of the church members get the money or the property. And so part of it is understanding where the assets go and what obligations have to be dealt with. Insurance, deeds, whatever, or you can have provisions in deeds that are reverted. If the church no longer exists or is no longer Southern Baptist, whatever the conditions are, that property will go to state convention, another church, an association, and that must be followed. You have to follow that. So, and that's where it comes down to the management of the real property. And again, we've had sadly different instances where churches have gone out and they've not handled the dissolution well. And that leaves a bad taste in everybody's mouth. So if a new church comes in, they have an uphill battle there. They've got to struggle to restore confidence in what the local church will be. So handling dissolution, dissolution may occur and churches may go out of business for one reason or another, but they need to do it in a way that's correct with the law, but also is a good witness to those around them. So that's probably enough on dissolution. It's not disillusion, it's dissolution. So with that in mind, again, church needs to act as a church and a corporation needs to act as a corporation.
So that covers our presentation on governing documents. Our next presentation is on May 18th, and we'll be going over various policies and procedures that we recommend a church have. Again, it'll be at 2 p.m. It'll be here at Redeeming Life Church, or for our friends in Idaho or people who don't want to drive here. Well, we actually have a friend in Idaho here, but for people who don't want to drive here, we'll also do this by Zoom as well. With that, are there any questions? Yes.
On page 5, under bylaws, the last line in your handout, the bylaws but are secondary. Is there a word missing? I take out but or what? It doesn't read quite right to me. But the bylaws are secondary.
Actually, you in a Mars bar, you asked the right question.
Well, where? The more.
It's in the mail. No, actually, that's just incorporate biblical principles, but those bylaws are secondary to the Bible.
Leave out the but.
Yeah, you can leave that part, but the bylaws are secondary to the Bible. Bible takes precedence.
Okay. That's what I crossed out. I want to make sure.
Yeah, cross out the word but. It should say the bylaws are secondary.
So your cross out is authorized.
change.
It's authorized. We don't need a motion. Did we have any chat questions? Okay, no chat questions. Other questions in the back here?
Okay, on page 11, when we're talking about the treasurer. And the statements, mailing the statements and what have you, are we talking about individual giving statements here? Are we talking about treasury report about what happened in the month? It's on page 11 and it says under the red, it says it should mail the most recent annual financial statements, if any. The church should mail the most recently published financial statements, if any. And the church should mail the documents within 15 days of the request. Are we talking? If someone comes to me and says, I want to see the March treasurer's report and I need to get that to them in that amount of time? Or are we talking that our monthly reports need to be mailed to everyone?
Okay, first principle, no, the first point is these are talking about financial statements of the church, not financial statements of individuals or individuals.
Okay.
Okay,
So we're talking about.
but in terms of that, most recent, if it's an annual statement, there's a required annual meeting. And so that's what this is referring to there, the annual meetings, the financial report or statement that's going to be submitted. It could be a year-end statement, however it's formulated there. But you also will have periodic financial statements, whether it's quarterly, monthly, or whatever. But it's all going to be essentially the same type of information.
Right.
Here's what we started out with different accounts, what the balances are, how much came in, where it come from, and where is it going, and what's left over. That
Okay. But
Yeah, it's I guess to be very specific about it, the key here is what have you turned over to your members in the past already, right? So like you don't, if your church does not publish, and I mean publish to like the entire church body, not just to a small group, but publish like your monthly statements, giving statements that are coming in, you don't need to turn that over. You only need to turn over what you have shown is coming in out on the yearly basis. But again, that kind of just depends on how much information you want to give to your church.
well, in our case, we do a monthly meeting and the statement of finances is given and there's what came in, what we spent, where it went, what we have left. But we don't mail that to anyone. We just give it to the people that attend that meeting. It is available if someone wants to ask for it.
if the concern is the mailing,
Yeah.
I think essentially the point is making sure it's effectively available to or delivered to.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's got to be requested, right? So you can continue your practice of giving out the monthly statements. This requirement is only if somebody comes to you and says, I want to see your finances, and they're a member of your church.
Specifically ask for it.
Mhm.
Then we should get it to them, but just the monthly, the routine reports is sufficient.
And I think whether you have monthly meetings, quarterly meetings, whatever the schedule is, one of the things people are really interested in is the budget. Are we over or under budget? And so periodic reports and that, you don't need to have a panel up, use an overhead and have it every church meeting or whatever. But the point is,
confused about the mailing part.
Yeah.
So that answered it. Thank you.
You'll probably cover this in your policies and procedures next meeting, but in the financial policies, our church has got an audit requirement.
Mhm.
Is that something that you would recommend? I mean, just right now, or,
Yeah, I would recommend it.
okay,
What you run into is, again, regardless of the size of the church, you want your finances to be handled in an impeccable way. And it's helpful to have professional help, such as the CPA or somebody that knows how to do those things. And not just Mabel, who happens to do tax returns for her neighbor. You know, you want somebody that has some background, because that's going to lend credibility to what you've done, and a sense of confidence from your members that, yes, everything's being done the way it should be done. But I would recommend an audit, but you don't, if you can do it annually, you can do it every so many years. You can have different levels of audits. It's not as though you're having to account to a lot of agencies. But but it's a good idea to have that audit. And if the church gets into a building program and needs to borrow money, a good audit history could be very valuable.
okay, I have one more comment about financial document retention. In 1985, we had a couple who were school teachers who both passed away the same year. They left a sum of money in a scholarship to be given to appropriate church members administered by the trustees. Do we still have the originating documents for that scholarship? Is that appropriate? Something like that, which has a designated outcome and a designated dispersal?
I would recommend, having us look at that to specifically, before we specifically say anything about that, because I'd be curious to see what the trust document says. If the trust document is giving the property to the church, giving the money to the church, then we may need to mention that in the financials. But if it's just one of those things where the church is like a trustee of that money, and the money is actually benefiting other people, it's not technically a finance of the church. So I would need to look at the trust document itself specifically to make any distinctions there.
It's a trust document, but it is a designated account in our financial system, that money is there, and then the interest on that account is what's given out as scholarships, and that's the way it was set up.
Well, again, I really recommend every church have a designated giving policy.
We do have.
And some of these things can be spelled out there.
Okay,
Now, as far as what to keep and disclose, you know, if it's been going how many years now?
since 1985.
1985, okay. So that's a lot of years. You don't necessarily need to come back and show every penny as a record, but the authority to do it, the designation, the restrictions or conditions that are involved, you want to maintain that original document at least. But it is helpful, and it could be helpful for us to review that and see if we can offer any suggestions to you.
And
Unless there is a trust that actually legally binding it to that point, designation means nothing to the IRS. So technically, the church is free. Once the money is given to the church is not obligated to stick by the designation. Now, a good best practice would be, if you want to keep receiving funds in the future, is do what the members want you to do.
Exactly.
But in reality, there is no legal obligation.
Well,
I get-
there can be a legal involved.
If there's a policy.
I would recommend just contacting us and having us take a look at it, and we're happy to do that. You're at Calvary Baptist up in Idaho Falls, right? So we're gonna be out there in October. So
Yeah, well, I'm gonna get them to you, maybe not safe deposit box, but I have access to that. So
Yeah.
that's not a problem. But it is something that occasionally causes a problem because it hasn't earned enough interest in the last few years to give scholarships out. But we don't want to dip into the principal because of the originating document.
yeah, so like I said, you can certainly find that document, send it to us. I'd be happy to let you know what I think.
I mean,
And then, like I said, we'll be out there in October, so we're looking forward to that.
point of interest about that couple, the wife's funeral was the first service held in the building that you're going to be occupying.
Oh, really? Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, you know, part, you know, you're dealing with that kind of thing. Designated giving, you have to be cautious with it. And that's why policy is important. You don't want to accept every gift that's offered. The IRS becomes involved if it's a question of whether or not a person donating can take it off as a deduction or not. And so you have to comply with some things with the IRS there. But as far as the church is concerned, it's a matter of contract, usually, and honoring what's been done. But it can happen. I can say, all right, I'm gonna give $10,000 to Calvary to send a missionary couple to Saudi Arabia in the next 6 weeks. That may not happen. So what happens to the money? Well, that will go back.
Right.
So anyway, any other questions?
Nothing online? All right, well, thank you again for attending in person, and for you online, thank you as well. Again, our next one is on policies and procedures on May 18th. We'll send out the reminders, and I will send out the link for the last presentation sometime later this week or next week. And then when this link is ready, we'll send that one out as well. You can also find all this on the Utah-Idaho Southern Baptist Convention's website under the legal tab. And that's the UISBC.org. And there's a legal tab that you can go under and find all this. Thank you again for coming, for those online and for those in person.
So.